Ooh, and speaking of clashing with the Pope, if you've been listening to me for a while, you know I can't help mentioning the Protestant Reformation, like whenever I can. It always factors in. It's like the ultimate historical context. And also, this episode is coming out on Easter in 2026, so it feels like I need to mention it. It just feels right. Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a podcast that covers the unpopular stories from history. Tales about disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. So if you looked at the title of today's episode and thought to yourself, Latrine, as in the toilet, you might have had two thoughts. One, there's no way Kelli is doing an episode involving a toilet, latrine must mean something else. Or two, Kelli would absolutely do something gross like an episode involving toilets. And the latter is correct. Today's episode is, in fact, about a disaster involving a toilet. And better yet, a medieval disaster involving a toilet. In the summer of 1184, German nobles met up at the Petersburg Citadel, or St. Peter's Church, in Erfurt to deal with some political disputes. In attendance was King Henry VI of Germany, who would later go on to be a Holy Roman Emperor. He was known for beginning Germany's crusade, which took place between the Third and Fourth Crusades, and he's also the guy who captured and then ransomed the beloved English king, Richard the Lionheart. More on that later. But before all of his work as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, he was a German king who needed to keep his noblemen in line. And in 1184, he found himself mediating a land dispute at Erfurt. But unfortunately, for many of the nobles in attendance, the floor was built over a cesspit. And under the weight of all those who were there, it collapsed. In today's episode, we're going to talk all about the Erfurt latrine disaster, the moment in medieval history when a bunch of nobles drowned in a pit of excrement and waste. This will be a gross episode, so buckle up, maybe don't eat anything for the next 25 or so minutes, and let's get started. I want to begin the way I traditionally begin an episode, which is to say, I want to talk about the historical context. For those of you who are new to the AFOUT podcast, historical context is what I consider to be one of the most important aspects of doing history. The context gives us a better appreciation for how and why things happen. We need to know what led to the event in question to better understand it. Learning about things in isolation, in bubbles, doesn't give us the full story. We need to connect everything to the broader picture. So for today's episode, that means that we need to know what events led to all of these men getting together at Erfurt to sort out their disputes. We also need to know about medieval buildings and sanitation architecture, or what are cesspits and why do they exist? And how does one end up under the floorboards of this building in Erfurt? Let's do the non-poopy history first. Why was there a meeting called here in the first place? And for that, let's look deeper into Henry VI's life. Sixth is so hard for me to say. Anybody else out there? Henry VI's life. Oh, and short tangent. There are going to be a lot of tangents in today's episode. It's like the good old days of the podcast. It's one of those meandering topics that has my mind wandering all over the place. This is a tangent about tangents. This might be a new low for me. Now, Henry VI became famous for his own exploits, but he was also the son of a very famous father, none other than the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa himself. So nicknamed by the Italians because of his distinct red beard. Barbarossa. Funny that the Italian nickname is what stood out for this German emperor. I read that they did call him Kaiser Rotbart, or Emperor Redbeard back home, but Barbarossa is what stuck. Probably because of Barbarossa's intense campaigns in Italy. 4 campaigns in Italy, to be precise. Now, I just got done doing a load of research about Stalingrad, the World War II battle, so in my head, I immediately went to Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's first failed attempt to invade and destroy the Soviet Union. And Operation Barbarossa was in fact named after the emperor. And there is a reason for it. Barbarossa, the man, launched the Third Crusade in 1189 to take back Jerusalem from Saladin, the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, and the de facto Muslim leader of the crusading states in the eastern Mediterranean. The Christians won the First Crusade in 1099 and claimed the holy city of Jerusalem, but they only had control of it for 88 years. Saladin recaptured the city in 1187. Incensed that the holy city was no longer in Catholic or even Christian hands, Barbarossa decided that he would spearhead the effort to take it back in what would become the Third Crusade. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's 1941 failed plan to destroy the Soviet Union, harkened back to that idea of the Germans marching into the East and claiming lands they believed should be theirs. Hitler called it Lebensraum, right? Living space. Like, that's our land, taking it back. And turns out it was kind of a failure for both leaders. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa died while on this crusade. And it wasn't even a cool death, like a battle fighting against his enemies, trying to reclaim the Holy Land. No, he drowned in June of 1190, age 67, in the Salif River in modern-day Turkey. While he was on his way. He didn't even get there. He was on his way to Jerusalem to reconquer the city, and he died en route. Here's a passage from a writer known as Ansbert, who wrote a contemporary account called The History of the Expedition of Emperor Frederick. Quote, on June 10th, 1190, the advance unit of the army camped on the plains of Seleucia. Up to this point, the whole army of the Holy Cross, the rich and the poor, the sick and those who seemed healthy, had journeyed through the glare of the sun and the burning beat of summer along a tortuous road which led them across rocky cliffs accessible only to birds and mountain goats. The emperor, who had shared in all of the dangers, wished both to moderate the inordinate heat and to avoid climbing the mountain peak. Accordingly, he attempted to swim across the very swift river. Wise though he was in other ways, the emperor foolishly tried his strength against the current and power of the river. Although everyone tried to stop him, he entered the water and plunged into a whirlpool. He, who had often escaped great dangers, perished miserably. End quote. Well, that sucks. And as a result, his eldest surviving son, Henry VI, became emperor soon after. And Henry later captured Richard the Lionheart on his way back from that same crusade, ransomed him for a boatload of money, and ended up going on his own German crusade himself with the money that he raised from the ransom. This was all just a long tangent, really, because what I want to talk about happened well before all of that. I guess it's just good to know that this is a very famous family, and one that seems to struggle with being submerged in liquid. On to the non-tangential historical context. When Henry was only 4 years old, his red-bearded father had him elected as King of the Romans. Germany is not a unified country yet. That doesn't happen until 1871. So while I and others might refer to the people who live in the Holy Roman Empire as Germans or Germanic, Germany technically is not a thing. It doesn't exist. It's not one unified state. It's the same way we might use the word Celts to refer to various Celtic peoples, though they weren't one unified group. Or the Greeks, too. Ancient Greece wasn't one unified country. We can talk about Rome, the empire, but we can't talk about Greece. The Greek city-states were independent. There was no one unified Greece. They just shared a culture. This doesn't matter. Kelli, focus on the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the various states within the Holy Roman Empire all had their own leaders and nobles. It was a decentralized monarchy composed of hundreds of principalities, duchies, free cities, territories. The King of the Romans, which was what Henry VI became at the wise old age of 4, was essentially the emperor-elect job. High-ranking princes from wealthy families would elect this king, and then he would later go on to serve as the emperor when the position opened up. It was kind of like the prerequisite political job. You had to be king of the Romans, and then you became the Holy Roman Emperor. Anyways, in 1184, an 18-year-old Henry VI was king of the Romans, and part of his job was to mediate disputes between his nobles and keep the peace, which was probably its own full-time job. There were constant squabbles and disputes between neighboring principalities. Now, 1184, there was a long-time dispute coming to a head between Ludwig III, Landgrave of Thuringia, and Conrad of Wittelsbach, the Archbishop of Mainz. Thüringen is how you would say it in Germany, but the English-speaking world commonly says Thuringia, so I'm gonna stick with that because sometimes my Northeast American diction has a really hard time with German pronunciation. And for those of you who are geography-minded, modern-day Thuringia is a region more or less in the center of Germany, right above Bayern. Think of it like a state or a county. Germany has 16 of them. Mainz is not its own state, it's the capital of the Rhineland-Palatinate state, west of Thuringia. They're relatively close to each other, is what I'm trying to convey, and there was a land dispute between them. Back to the medieval period. So Ludwig and Conrad were in the midst of a relatively standard land dispute. This happened, and still happens, all of the time. Every conflict ever, big or small, is about land. Either the land itself, what the land represents, what resources are in that land, the people who are living on the land. Regardless, it's always about land. Now, we don't actually know what this land dispute was about. That part has been lost to history as far as we know, but things were so tense between these two rival families that the king of the Romans had to step in. So Henry VI called for a Hoftag, or an informal assembly, on July 25th. Erfurt was chosen as the location for this informal Hoftag to sort out the Thuringian and Mainzer land dispute because it was ruled by Henry's family line, the Hohenstaufens. And if that family name sounds familiar to you, it's because the Hohenstaufens are known for growing the Holy Roman Empire to its largest size, and they also clashed quite frequently with the Pope. Ooh, and speaking of clashing with the Pope, if you've been listening to me for a while, you know I can't help mentioning the Protestant Reformation, like whenever I can. I don't even know why. I don't even like that period of history very much. It always factors in. It's like the ultimate historical context. And also, this episode is coming out on Easter in 2026, so it feels like I need to mention Catholicism. It feels like I need to mention it. It just feels right. Now, it's not until 1517 that the Protestant Reformation officially breaks out in the Holy Roman Empire, and many of those same principalities in the Holy Roman Empire turned against the Roman Catholic Church in favor of Protestantism. Fun side tangent fact thing. Erfurt isn't just the place where nobles drowned in poo, which I swear we are getting to soon. It's also considered one of the early centers of Protestantism. Martin Luther studied there and was ordained in Erfurt's Catholic Cathedral in 1507. After the Protestant Reformation began, Protestant churches opened up in town as well, though it's worth noting that there was still a considerable Catholic influence in the city, and today it's got a healthy mix of both. But anyways, the Hohenstaufens were in power in Erfurt, and our young King Henry VI was the ruler of that town, which made it the perfect place for the Hoftag. Instead of going to either Thuringia or Mainz, why not make these quarreling nobles schlep on over to the king's digs and lay out their petty land squabbles there? In attendance was Louis Landgrave, Archbishop Conrad, some members of Henry's court, some local nobles and bishops, a spattering of knights belonging to all the aforementioned people, and some other prominent Erfurt citizens. And Henry decided to meet in a 2-story building near the Erfurt Cathedral on the upper floor. I've read some reports claim that it was within the Petersburg Citadel itself or a building on the grounds, but regardless of which building it was, this is where things went wrong. The support beams that held up the top floor were rotten through. Perhaps with a few people standing up there, you wouldn't notice, and there wouldn't be any additional damage. But with dozens of people? Now, I've read estimates of anywhere between 60 to 100 people were involved in this incident, although I think the lower end is a more realistic figure. But before we talk about the long, hard fall into the bog of eternal stench, let's take a quick look at medieval architecture, including the concept of a cesspit. A cesspit, often interchangeably called a cesspool, is a giant pit designed to hold our waste. There's no nicer way to say it. It's literally a giant shaft or a pit dug into the earth, usually lined with brick, designed to hold everything we expel out the backside. Like a porta potty, but the waste stays in the ground. And they were perfectly normal parts of medieval life. But I don't want you to think it's because human society hadn't figured out sanitation yet. Let's rewind even further. If you remember much from your ancient history course, if you even took one, there were 6 main population centers that developed from small agricultural villages into the first urban societies. The first 2 are the often overlooked American ones, the Olmecs of Mesoamerica and the Andean civilizations of the Coral Supe. In Afro-Eurasia, we've got the Mesopotamians on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which is mostly in modern-day Iraq, the Egyptians on the Nile, the ancient Chinese on the Yellow River, and the Indus River Valley civilization on the Indus River in modern-day Pakistan and India. And it's that last one, the Indus River Valley civilization, where we get our best examples of urban sewage systems. The 2 main cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, were organized in a grid pattern with sewage infrastructure in place. They had toilets in their homes, drain pipes, and covered street drains that lined their streets made out of brick and mortar. The waste would flow from the toilet to the street drains and out of the city centers into the nearby Indus River, keeping waste and the diseases associated with waste away from the crowded population. Guys, the Indus River Valley civilization existed between 2600 and 1900 BCE. My point is that it's not like sewage systems, toilets, and sanitation practices didn't exist by 1154, thousands of years later. They just weren't established in Northern Europe. There was no, decent pre-existing infrastructure for underground drainage or sewer pipes. In fact, and this is also pretty gross, London got its first proper modern sewage system in the 19th century, the 1800s, y'all. There was an event known as the Great Stink of London in 1858, where a sweltering summer combined with too much sewage waste in the Thames led to a very stinky situation around Parliament, the part of river that runs next to Parliament. I mean, it had always been pretty bad, but the rich people at Parliament only just started to deal with it in 1858. And it was so bad that a chief engineer, Sir Joseph Bazalgette, was brought in to design an underground sewage system to prevent this from happening in the future. I did an episode about this. It was part of the London cholera epidemic, which was my 8th episode. 8th episode! And to think this is number 77. I've come so far. Anyway, as cities quickly grew throughout Northern Europe, things were just being built. There wasn't a lot of long-term planned sanitation infrastructure going on. So the important question at hand is, where would the poop go? Well, a lot of times, the business would be done in a bucket. A chamber pot, they were called, and a household servant would be responsible for emptying and cleaning it daily, which is an awful job, no thank you. Sometimes the chamber pot would just be dumped out the window into the street or tossed in the river if you were close enough. I remember I read sources where if you were dumping the chamber pot out the window, like from a 2nd or 3rd story room, like they would yell out the window, like, watch out! You do not want to be underneath this when it's dumped into the street. Now, if you were fancy, you had access to a cesspit, and not just a bucket in the gross corner of your room. The contents of this cesspit was known as night soil. People would do their business in rudimentary toilets, sometimes literally just holes in a stool positioned over a hole in the ground, that would send it all down into the cesspit, which would later be cleaned out by the night soil men, also known as rakers, because they would rake the poo, who would physically remove the poo and take it somewhere else so it didn't clog the streets. And it was a relatively well-paid job. Sometimes the cesspit would be in the basement of a house, or sometimes your waste would tumble into a community cesspit that contained everyone's shared excrement. This is so gross, I know. Just try not to think too hard about what I'm saying. Don't visualize it. Maybe that'll help. Ooh, castles had cool toilets. I've seen some, like at the Tower of London, that are just holes built into the side of the brickwork. Like, think you have a tower, you have a turret, right? And then there'd be a part jutting out, almost like a bay window, with a hole, and you would just sit there and do your business. Just poop into the open air. Now, normally it would fall into a cesspit below, or a moat, or a river. It depends on the location. Sometimes there was an internal cesspit, and the holes weren't for the poop, but to help the air come into the room to air out everything that's going down in there. And in case you're weird like me, you might be wondering where the poop goes. I keep telling you that it goes into a cesspit, and I've told you that people collect it, but where do they take it? I mean, it can't just sit in cesspits for forever, right? If you live with a septic tank instead of a sewage system, you know that eventually that thing needs to be serviced and emptied. It doesn't magically disappear into some fecal back rooms where all the missing socks from the dryer also end up. Well, before we had chemical fertilizers, human waste was often used. Farmers would use the nutrients in the waste in their fields, so the rakers would bring all of that poop outside city walls to where the farms were, and in this way it was recycled? This is why it's important to wash your fruits and veggies, people. Now, some cesspits were just simply covered up and left there, kind of like with landfills. When they get full, they just cover it up and start a new one. The ones that were too hard to access or too full, that's what they would do. They would just cover it up, and new cesspits were dug underground nearby. So just underground caverns of poop left to seep into the soil if the brick lining wasn't done properly. And that actually reminds me of my episode on Paris's catacombs. They had a contaminated soil problem too, and at one point the basement walls of a church where they buried a lot of bodies after the French Revolution, because there were a lot of bodies after the French Revolution, they were all buried underground, and at one point, like, the basement walls of a church caved in and all of those dead bodies and decomposition goop came tumbling in. That was episode 16. That was pretty gross too. Sometimes collected night soil was just tossed into the river. Out of sight, out of mind, right? Until everyone is throwing poop into the river and it becomes polluted, and then you've got cholera outbreaks. Ooh, fun fact. You might think that in our modern world, we wouldn't still have a problem with raw sewage in our natural water systems. You would be wrong. The River Thames in London is still heavily contaminated with feces. The Thames Water Company, which is the company that runs the Thames, it's kind of obvious from the name, over the past few years has been fined hundreds of millions of pounds for illegal sewage discharges. And do you remember the 2024 Paris Olympics? The Seine River cutting through Paris was so heavily contaminated with E. coli, which only really originates in one place, and the levels were so high that events were postponed and training sessions canceled until they could sanitize it. And that's just in the Western world. Polluted water sources are a global issue, and there are billions of people on this earth who do not have access to clean water. Okay, too much poop talk. My broader point here is that cesspits, literal pits of human feces underneath your home, were normal medieval sanitation practices. And there was one in the basement of the building in Erfurt where Henry VI had about 60-odd people meet to discuss a minor land dispute, which was a totally normal thing for 1184. But unfortunately, the building was falling apart, and below the floorboards was something, in my opinion, much worse than the pit of Sarlacc on Tatooine. As upwards of 60 people crowded into the top floor of the building next to the cathedral in Erfurt, assembling to meet with their king, Henry VI, the rotten beams finally broke, and the floor fell out from underneath them. And once the top floor caved in, the weight of all of those people falling caused parts of the main floor to collapse as well, right into the cesspit underneath. Alright, there's a few possible outcomes here, in no particular order. People either fell 2 stories into the muck and drowned in a combination of excrement and urine. They might have fallen onto the first floor and gotten crushed by debris and woodwork on the way down. According to some sources, they might have asphyxiated by the noxious fumes and stench. I mean, it's just pure rotting sewage down there. It's not been treated with anything. Or maybe they managed to not fall in by grabbing hold of something. Now, luckily for our young king, he did not fall into the waste. He and Archbishop Conrad of Mainz were apparently sitting in a stone window alcove, so they avoided the fall by grabbing hold of some iron window railings, and the pair were not subjected to the horrors of the cesspit. They later apparently had to be rescued because there was no longer a floor or stairs for them to use to climb down. The other named NPC here, Ludwig Landgrave of Thuringia, did fall into the pit. He was rescued, and I don't know if any others were. He just lucked out, I suppose. I'll be honest that the source material for this story might suffer from a game of telephone, where the story changes slightly with each iteration, so the story itself becomes a little warped. There's very little information about it. We know that it happened, it definitely happened, but a lot of the original source material has been lost or exaggerated, so, a little sketchy. But anyways, an estimated 60 people died in the Erfurt Latrine disaster. Not all from drowning in the waste, but still, 60 people. Ooh, fun mini bonus story. Erfurt might be the largest cesspit-related death event in history that I can think of, but it's not the only one. In 1326, an Englishman named Richard the Raker was doing his business on the toilet, but the thing broke, and he fell through the floor into his own cesspit. And the irony was that he was a raker, so he was paid to empty out excrement from other people's pits and latrines, but I guess he hadn't done his own in a long time. Poor Richard the Raker drowned in his own filth, which is a pretty horrible way to go. So, did anything change as a result of this malodorous meeting at Erfurt? Not really. The Great Stink that I mentioned earlier, the one that impacted London in the 19th century, that, in combination with a nasty cholera outbreak, that led to some serious sanitation reforms. This event? Not so much. Reportedly, King Henry, who, remember, is only 18 at this point, was so impacted by this tragedy that he just left Erfurt. He was in the middle of some military maneuvers in Italy at the time when he had to come home to deal with the whole dispute, so he just returned to what he was doing. As far as we know, there was no decision made. They met to deal with it, a bunch of people fell into human waste and died, and the survivors just dispersed. And I don't blame them. I'd also want to forget the whole thing happened. You wouldn't want to be known as the king and later emperor who survived the latrine disaster, now would you? It's a good thing Henry survived the incident, though. He went on to do some powerful things as the Holy Roman Empire, like the aforementioned situation of capturing Richard the Lionheart and using the ransom money to fund his own crusade, the German Crusade. But unfortunately, like father, like son, Henry VI also died while on his crusade. Not in a river this time like his dad, but likely of malaria while en route to the Holy Lands. He died in Sicily in 1198 at the age of 31. Maybe his death was a final destination kind of situation, where he was meant to actually die in the latrine disaster at Erfurt, but he managed to escape death. So instead, he was killed by malaria, a disease which, among other symptoms, causes diarrhea? Maybe he never escaped that fate after all. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelli Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode on the Erfurt latrine disaster. Thank you for tuning into my podcast, and check out some of my other episodes if you want more. I referenced number 8 today and number 16. Very, very poopy episodes. If you want to support the show, I've got a link in the description for Buy Me a Coffee, a site where fans can fund small creators like me, but without having to sign up for an account. I would of course appreciate any help you can give me, but honestly, I just appreciate that you listen to me talk about cool, and in this case really gross, history stuff. Be sure to like and follow my podcast, available wherever you listen so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.